I'm going to speak to you about root lesion nematode in 2013. As we've all spoken about today, it was a great cropping season for most areas in 2013 in Western Australia. But it was also a year that we saw the incidence, a really high incidence of root lesion nematode symptoms in paddocks right across the growing area. So I'm going to discuss with you this afternoon the reasons that we think that root lesion nematode had such a good year. And it does run with the theme that we've been talking about today, and that is, it's about, underlying factor is about rainfall. So of course I need to thank my sponsors, or the people who fund our work. I work for the Department of Agriculture and Food, and our funding comes from GRDC. So root lesion nematode, what is it? It's a migratory endoparasite. So I have a picture here that is a very, a very effective representation of root lesion nematode. They're microscopic, they're like microscopic worms, and what you can see here is a root system, and they're migratory endoparasites because they are able to move into a root system. They feed within the root system, but they also have the ability to move on if they so choose. So they may spend their life cycle within that root, or if it becomes too crowded, or the root becomes dies off and they decide that they'd like to go elsewhere, they can. And that's the reason in a lot of circumstances when we go into paddocks, we ask for a good and a bad sample, because often in the bad area of your crop, the nematodes have already moved on and they're now working in the good, what looks to you like a good area of your crop. Now there are lots of reasons that root lesion nematode is a really successful pest, and I've given some of the main reasons that are of concern for broadacre cropping here. They concentrate, we think, in Western Australia in the top 15 centimetres. This is basically, we're saying that they're concentrating in the root zone. So if you have a paddock that is able to use more of the profile, the root lesion nematode will probably be sitting in more of the profile as well. In the eastern states, where they get their root profiles moving down to a metre, then the nematodes, root lesion nematodes that they have over there also impact right down to over a metre in depth. Now this is one of the big kickers for root lesion nematode. It's called anhydrobiosis, and it means that these nematodes are able to dehydrate over the summer period. When in spring, when the soil start to dry down, so do the nematodes. So this means that they're able to dry out over the summer period, and when they have a rainfall event, and this is the key to what we're talking about for 2013, they are able to rehydrate, become active, invade the roots and continue their life cycle. And this gives them the ability to have many, and it also means that they are good breeders. They breed many times within a season. So if they are able to start early, they have a lot more chance to multiply within the root systems. So why should you care? This is a really good question, and I really like to think about this one. There are so many things that as growers or consultants you need to consider within a paddock. The reason that you should care about root lesion nematode, although you can't get rid of it in the season that you see it, it does have a very wide host range. So that means it probably, if you have RLN in a paddock, it probably likes the crop that you're currently growing. It probably also likes to eat whatever you put in the paddock between your growing cycles. So it is important to know if it's there and whether you're managing it for whatever's going to happen in the future. The numbers can become yield limiting really quickly. I had a grower say to me last year, I've never seen root lesion nematode in any of my paddocks, we don't have it. And he came to see, we got a sample from him at the end of the season, and he had one of the highest nematode levels in his paddock that we'd seen for 2013. And this is because when conditions are right, the nematode numbers can increase really well. So a lot of the paddocks that I end up going to are what we call the holy crap paddocks, and that's where a grower hasn't seen an issue before, but the circumstances prevail that they've actually have it in a huge way in that season. You can't control them, but you can manage them. And we're still in the circumstance where there are no nematicides that are economically viable for broadacre situations, so it's all about management, crop rotation and variety choices. And the numbers speak for themselves. They're in 65% of our paddocks in Western Australia. Root lesion nematode then means that we're in 5.3 million hectares of our cropping area. and we think that they're yield limiting in 40%. I say think because we are currently doing a lot of yield experimentation now and over the next 5 years to try and give you some more up-to-date numbers. So if they're yield limiting, we think that they're yield limiting up to $190 million per annum. So the numbers really do speak for themselves. 2013 was a year that we have decided to look more closely at distribution of RLN in Western Australia and to really start to get a hold of the numbers that say where it is, what species are important in West Australian cropping, and what levels that actually cause yield limiting situations. So we decided we've done a survey that we will probably continue into 2014. We looked at 130 paddocks. We did this by accessing root and soil samples from other people who work in DAFWA's, their trial sites. We accessed 50 focus paddock sets of information. We also gathered information from AgWest Plant Lab diagnostic services, and we went to about 30 paddocks ourselves and have done testing on those paddocks. So as you can see, that means that it is quite a targeted sample. We went looking for RLN and we certainly found it. It was in all cropping areas and it was in 90% of the paddocks that we tested. Now, the numbers are just as we expected. Pradolenchus neglectus is our main root lesion nematode in Western Australia, and we did find that in 68% of the sampled paddocks. And Pradolenchus teres, which is our West Australian Pradolenchus, was in 24% of the paddocks. So this is a pictorial representation from a database that we've been building. On the one side, it shows all of the data that we've collected so far, and this is just to give you that visual impression of where the concentration of RLN is and the fact that it is right across our cropping zone. And then you can see from that 130 paddocks that a lot of the samples that we have are down in the south of our growing regions, but again, they were right across the growing area. So this is what I saw. Now, remembering that I did go to the paddocks where growers and consultants were just scratching their heads and hoping it wasn't what they were thinking it was. So I'll just go through some of the symptoms that we saw. Now, travelling from Mount Barker to Williams, this is actually a whole paddock situation where he's got Pradolenchus teres across a whole paddock that he now has to deal with. And again, this is a paddock where he'd never seen RLN before. Now, I'd just like to point out this one in Kendanup because this is a situation where I can argue with one of our other researchers. Pradolenchus, RLN and Rhizoctonia like to work together, and when they're both together in a paddock, obviously it exacerbates the issues because they both prune roots. Now, some of the symptoms are less visible. This is when you have a waviness, but pretty much most of the paddocks I went to had big bloody holes in them. There, you can see there at the South Stirlings, that's an NVT site where the NVT barley and the NVT wheat was absolutely hammered by root lesion as well. So now just drilling down on some of those numbers, we've got, this is looking at the species of nematode that we had running across the top, and it shows that a lot of situations that we actually have mixed species populations. And then when you look, I'm going here from nil down to high infestations. So infestations of 0.2 to about into this area. From here you obviously won't see many symptoms, but moving down into these areas you start with about 15% yield loss down to about 50% yield loss or more in these sort of numbers. So again, you see here in 117 paddocks we found RLN. In 13, only 13 of those we didn't get any RLN at all. When you look at where we've got Pradolenchus neglectus and Pradolenchus teres, these are really good numbers of paddocks, and we also found Pradolenchus penetrans. This is a nematode that behaves really differently from the other RLNs that we have in Western Australia, and finding it in those paddocks, although it was only 2 paddocks, we think it does have a restricted distribution in Western Australia, and it may be quite close to the horticultural areas. Penetrans is actually a big issue in horticulture, so it may be that sort of soil type and that we may find it more commonly. But we need to know a lot more about this because of its behaviour. It really is a different beast. Now, I just wanted to point out here as well that we are talking about yield losses in these situations. So we have here 48% of paddocks. We're looking at yield losses that are anywhere between 15 and 50%. So this is a significant area that we're talking about. And there's only a small number of paddocks that actually had this one would have actually maybe in a situation where they could be increasing their nematode numbers, but they wouldn't be seeing any visual impacts at this stage. So now I get to the why. Why did we have this RLN picnic in 2013? I've got rainfall leading into 2014. Look, I'm ahead of myself already. So this is a story that has three parts. Root lesion nematode, we think, was in such a big issue in 2013. Firstly, because of the rainfall events that we had leading up to the season. A number of areas had 3 significant rainfall events that were outside the usual rainfall for their areas. Some had 2, some had 3. This meant that there was a big, some had a green bridge that came right through from 2012. Some people had a really good weed burden, or some of the volunteer crops, apparently particularly where there was canola, looked like a whole new canola crop by the time they were sprayed out for the next crop. And there were people who had pastures. The pastures were obviously nice and healthy and big as well. And these are all issues that would have started the nematode cycle before the season even began. And then we also had the situation where not only that, but we led into a really dry June and half of July where the crops were small, they became stressed, and because the nematodes were already there and already having a great time, the plants weren't able to grow away from the issue. So often when you have an unstressed crop, the plants can accommodate for the root pruning that's occurred and keep on growing. But in this situation, they had no water, they were becoming stressed, so therefore they just didn't get away. And once they get past a certain point, they never really recovered during the season. So I'm just going to travel through these different areas of the growing area so that you can see the kind of system that I'm talking about. A lot of areas had this rainfall events in January, March and May. So the dotted line will always be the average and the solid line is what happened during the season. So here we have Badgingarra, then we go through to Condinum, and although obviously the rainfall is much less in these areas, they still have it. And then you have this desperately dry June. Again, in Wickerpin, they didn't get the January rains, but they certainly got significant rains. Williams, Ongerup, and then just to top them all off was Esperance that had a huge rainfall year. So when I talked about the pastures, a lot of the areas that I did go to are areas that actually have pasture between their crops, and in these circumstances people may be inadvertently increasing their nematode numbers between their cropping seasons because quite a number of the pasture types are actually susceptible to RLN. There is some good news. We certainly have, this is looking at Pradolenchus neglectus. It does look at things like Cerodellas, Sulas, and were actually good, and they would reduce the numbers of nematodes in a paddock. And Angelo Loy has been doing a lot of work with this. When you start moving into the moderately susceptible things like some of the clovers and the lucerne I have here, this is when you are increasing your nematode numbers, but probably not very quickly. So given the right season, these ones may not have a very big impact. Now the bad news where pastures are concerned, the clovers, the bicerulas, the subclovers and the medics all vary between susceptible and very susceptible. So if you have pastures that have these in them, these plants in them, you may be causing a problem when you are actually trying to do the right thing by your land as far as RLN is concerned. So we also need to look here because, as I said, a number of people had volunteer crops coming through that really did behave like weeds. Now, a lot of the paddocks that I went to were people either had sprayed out very late, or they had, interestingly, canola in the season before they grew the crop where they had the issue. But they had big canola plants before they sprayed them out. So this is just to give you an idea of what this nematode prefers to eat. In yellow you have lupins, field peas in purple, canola is in orange, and then barley, green, wheat is blue. So you can see this is Pretilencus teres. We know that that barley and wheat are its preferred foods, and it will multiply really readily in these. So we usually suggest, if people have issues with RLN, to grow field pea or lupins. And canola, in the past we haven't thought that canola made much of a difference to RLN, but what we're learning moving forward is that canola does just quietly increase in numbers, and as people move into rotations that are going from wheat, canola, barley, they're just increasing them over and over without having a break. Now, I just wanted to show you Pretilencus penetrans, because this nematode has a completely different preference as far as multiplication is concerned. It prefers lupins and field peas, we suspect. We really do need to do more research on this one. This is a glasshouse trial that follows up a previous glasshouse trial in 2003, so we've got a lot more work to do on this one. But as you can see, it does appear, this is not saying that it doesn't like to eat wheat and barley, but that actually field pea and lupin are its preferred choice, and so we have to give completely the opposite advice as far as penetrans is concerned. And this highlights the fact that you really need to know what nematode you're dealing with. Pretilencus teres and Pretilencus neglectus behave differently, and they will have different preferences as far as varieties within crops are concerned, but it does look at this stage like Pretilencus teres and Pretilencus neglectus at least have the same cropping choices as far as the general ratings are concerned. But this third one is completely different again. So what should you grow for what RLN you have? It's simply a case here of just outlining again what I've just said. If you have teres or neglectus, barley and wheat will really increase your numbers within a paddock. Canola will increase. You won't probably see any symptoms in your canola, but you may be inadvertently increasing something for your next crop. And lupins and field peas are a good choice to bring down your numbers. If you're in one of those paddocks that sits in that 15 to 50% range, you certainly want to be looking at these as some of your choices. If you have Pretilencus penetrans, this one seems to have a really big impact in crop. And the two paddocks that we actually looked at this year were from paddock of pasture and a paddock of canola, where RLN symptoms were really prevalent in his canola crop. So be aware that penetrans is around. We need to know more about it, and we'll find out more about its distribution as we move along. But it likes to eat lupins and field peas, also likes canola, and barley and wheat will continue to increase its numbers, but probably not to the same extent. So now I just wanted to give you a good news story. I've called this sunny days in Esperance, although they didn't have very many over the season. We went to a paddock in response to a grower concern. He had a whole 40-hectare paddock of grazing wheat where it was awful, and he didn't really know what was going on. They looked at everything, as people usually do before they get to nematodes. They thought it was nutrition, then they thought they put the wrong sprays on, then they finally got to nematodes and called us. He had a really high number of nematodes in this paddock, and it was for the whole paddock, and he had a 46% yield loss in this season. He hadn't seen symptoms of root lesion nematode in that paddock before. So he's allowed us to go in to run a trial, and we're going to use this trial to run a whole lot of varieties this year. So in 2013 we went into the Esperance paddock, and we did a randomised block design where we grew either canola to increase nematode numbers or lupins to decrease nematode numbers. And in the rest of the paddock, on Angelo's advice, the grower put in soft-seeded Ceradella. Now, he was really happy with Ceradella. He found that really effective, and he will this year attempt to put in this grazing wheat again. So in that paddock we actually went out and we looked, of course, at our trial area where we had the canola and the lupins, At the beginning of the season, it was quite solidly balanced at 4 to 5 nematodes per mil of soil. That is a high number of nematodes moving into a season. And we also looked at an area, a similar sized area, which would have been 120 metres by 80 metres in the Ceradella area. And we assessed it both at the beginning and the end of the season. And as you can see, the canola did multiply the nematode numbers. Lupins did bring it down to 2, but the Ceradella brought the numbers down most efficiently to 1 nematode per mil or gram of soil. Now, we suggest that 1 nematode per gram of soil is a number that you may start to see symptoms of nematodes in, given the right circumstances. In Western Australia, it's very different in different parts of Australia, and this information that I have here comes from a Predictor B test. So do be aware that Predictor B is it is becoming more specific to our West Australian conditions, but we are still working on it. So you really need to get more advice if you're unsure about what your numbers in the soil actually mean when you get a test back. Please either talk to us at DAFWA or look a little bit further through some of the research results that you can find. So that's where I come to my summary and say it was a great year for nematodes. I know that sounds very strange. I think that one of the reasons that it was so seen in crops is because there were such good crops for it to be seen in. There were big holes that were quite obvious in the paddocks, and people were looking more at their crops because they were worth looking at. We did find RLN in 90% of paddocks, so it'll be interesting to see if the season is really different this year. What we find in comparison in a more usual growing. Let's hope we have a more usual growing season where it rains where it should rain and doesn't rain where it shouldn't rain. We think that the Green Bridge had a big impact on this because the nematodes were already there and they were already in good numbers before the season even started. And then that plant stress period was the final kicker to create a great season for nematodes. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Really depends on the season that you have. I mean, if you have a season where you have a summer rainfall event and then it's dry, the nematodes will actually hydrate, they'll look for something to eat, it won't be there, and they'll die off. So you'll end up having a better circumstance with those summer rainfall events. It's where they actually have the opportunity to find something to eat and the plants stay alive up into the season that we have the issue. I'd really like to do some work looking at different spray out times. We haven't done that work. We need another season like last season to be able to do that work. We have actually talked to the group from the coast to Stirlings, or have I got that the wrong way around? Stirlings to coast. Coast to... Thank you. And if we have the opportunity, we would like to run a trial where we look at different spray out periods this season. Soil types that nematodes generally like is sandy soils. Generally we say that once you get a increasing clay content, nematodes basically, the way they move is they swim between the pore spaces. So when you have small pore spaces in your soil, they are less able to move around. They like the gravelly, basically they like the really crappy soils. So they like the gravelly soils as well. And as far as doing a test, an in-season test through the Department of Agriculture Diagnostic Services needs to be done during the season when we can receive a plant sample. If you wanted to do a Predictor B, they have traditionally said that Predictor B can be done during the summer period, anywhere up to the break. But I think that we're heading towards the idea that Predictor B may actually be better taken towards the end of the season. So you can take, because then you have the higher disease incidences that you can look at for the next season.